Some themes and speakers have appeal across disciplinary boundaries. They really speak to the issues of the day in the social sciences. And the AISSR lecture series is a platform for these types of lectures, a place to discuss fundamental questions for all social sciences.
Thanks to all of you for coming out here today. My talk may have relevance for the present, and so I do want to start in the present. My talk will be deeply historical, but I do think that speaking of the present is ultimately what speaking historically can be about. As you may or may not know, for decades now, even before the recent events with ICE, local police forces in the United States and in Britain have been armed like armies. We see this in the suppression of pro-Palestinian protests in the US in recent years, across various cities and, of course, in various universities, such as Columbia University, where the New York Police Department dispatched their heavily militarized police force known as the Strategic Response Group to suppress student protesters. I'll say something about that group later. But note, too, this militarized policing goes back even further. We've seen it in the United States. For example, during the protests in 2014 in Ferguson, the Black Lives Matter protests that followed. We've seen it in 2020. We've seen it in 2016, where police officers shut down protesters at Standing Rock. So we even see this in everyday policing. Now, this militarization, as it's called, should be both frightening and puzzling. What is militarization, after all? Well, according to the sociologist Peter Kraske, militarization is a process whereby civilian police increasingly draw from and pattern themselves around the tenets of militarism and the military model. And this can involve, and this is crucial, not just material aspects of the military, such as guns, but cultural, organizational, and operational aspects as well. What this means, then, is that police bear the arms and mindsets of armies, ready to treat citizens as enemies of war, as foreign aggressors, even though those various citizens' taxes are what is paying for the militarized police in the first place. What's also puzzling is that if you know about the history of the police in the US, you'll know that theoretically it's not supposed to be this way. Now, here in Europe, in countries like the Netherlands, national police forces have long been kind of militarized. This is a legacy of Napoleon's occupation, which essentially meant that most European countries ended up with militarized police akin to the French gendarmerie. In the United States and England, a different model of policing was born. In the United States, the police force followed the model of the civil police. This is a model of policing that was born in Britain in 1829 when Sir Robert Peel created the London Metropolitan Police. This was the very first professional, centralized, uniform police department. The model of the Met subsequently spread to the United States, where cities also created their own police departments. But here again, this is a puzzle, because the civil police was meant by Peel to be an alternative to military force. Peel invented the model and implemented it in England as a new state organization to fight crime and disorder without having to rely upon the military. And he and his peers created the model in opposition to the heavily militarized police then on the continent, like the French gendarmerie. The civil police, then, has insinuated this bifurcation that we have in our heads and that we live with in our states between, on the one hand, the police, and on the other hand, the army. And the bifurcation is this. The army is supposed to be for violent coercion on enemies overseas, while the police is for citizens at home. Even the US Army articulates this opposition, right? And in this regard, the term civil police is especially fitting. The word civil, of course, invokes the citizen, the idea of the citizen, as in a police force of, by, and for the citizens, rather than for foreigners and enemies. It likewise summons the idea of civility, hence peace, rather than brute force. But again, militarization means that the civil police transgress this stated ideal. The police and the military are more and more alike rather than different, such that citizens become treated as enemies of war. This puzzle stages my intervention, which I want to further explore in my talk. I ask a deceitfully simple question. Why and how? How is it that the civil police have become militarized? In other words, how did we get here? Now, to answer, I primarily look at Britain and the United States. That's because where the so-called civil police was born and propagated. I will trace out the origins of this modern civil police and what has happened over time, all the way to the present moment. So ultimately, as I've mentioned, this is a kind of historical approach, but it is a historical approach spirited by the conviction that what is needed today, what is needed to understand our present, is a historical, sociological understanding of the past. In other words, I sketch out a kind of historical sociology of the present. And I hope that my talk today might convince those of you who aren't historically minded to see the value of historical sociology, to see the value of historical understanding. And ultimately, what I want to say today goes against common conventional understandings of policing in several respects. The first has to do with historicization. Now, when you talk to people in the United States or even Britain, and they talk about the militarization of policing, they tend to see it as something that's relatively new, something that's happened since, say, the early 2000s with the war on terror, or maybe a little bit further back into the 1990s or 1980s with the war on drugs. By contrast, I will show that the so-called civil police in both Britain and the United States has been militarized from the very outset, and that there's been kind of a constant militarization over time. In fact, there have been multiple moments when the police have increasingly aggressively drawn upon military tools and tactics, different waves of militarization over time. The second claim is that these waves of militarization are not haphazard. They manifest deeper logics. And these logics have to do with things that most scholars of policing don't take seriously enough. That is, empire and the global color line. My claim is that to understand police militarization, and I would argue police broadly, as an institution, we need to understand policing's deep racialized imperiality, or more simply put, its coloniality. And what I will ultimately try to convince you of is that police militarization is perhaps not the best word for what's going on. It's a kind of category error. What we call police militarization is, in fact, the appearance of a deeper process, which I will think of as the Imperial Boomerang. So, I'm going to elaborate these points in the next half hour or so. And we're going to look at different moments in time, these different waves, where we can see these points at work. I'm going to begin where it all began, in 1829, with the London Metropolitan Police. Now, to understand this, the importance of the founding of the London Met, we really have to recognize how important of an organization, how novel of an organization this really was. Before this time, policing as we know it didn't really exist. The word police did not refer to police departments or an institution so much as an act or function of government, and it often referred to, as in Adam Smith's writings, regulation of the economy. There were no police departments as we know them today. To deal with crime, London and all of England only had a motley array of watchmen and local parish constables, many of whom were part-time, volunteered, ununiformed, or paid by fees. Citizens, not the state, were expected to regulate themselves. To deal with social disorder, with strikes or demonstrations or riots, the English state had to call in the army. The new police of London changed all that. It brought a centralized, full-time, professionalized uniformed police that was tasked with tackling crime and regulating public order at once. And this is why it is apt to refer to the London and American police model as the civil police. It was meant to be, it was meant to replace the army and be a force of civilians under civilian control, aimed at crime prevention and as well as maintaining order. And so this was the police force that other cities then emulated. The earliest Emulators in England were Liverpool, Bristol, Birmingham, Manchester. We can see later why these cities are significant. In the United States, the first cities included New York City, Chicago, and in the South, Savannah and Charleston were the first modern police departments. So this is about the founding of the police, but what does this have to do with militarization? Let me clarify this. On the one hand, the police, as I mentioned, was meant to be an alternative to the military, right? In England, riots and disturbances had led the officials to have to call in the army, but this became far too dangerous and onerous. Officials began worrying that calling in the army would provoke too much opposition from the citizenry, and you had events such as the strikes at Peterloo, where citizens were killed by the army. So officials began thinking about alternatives, and one of the alternatives was conceived by this man, Sir Robert Peel, who at the time was the Home Secretary of Britain. And he initially thought, well, let's set up a kind of French-style gendarmerie for England. And in France at the time, this national military police force, which was controlled by the military. The problem was that Peel knew that this would not fly in England. It wouldn't sit well with his upper class or middle class friends, much less with the rest of the citizenry, because if there was anything that the English despised at the time, it was French-style militarism. So Peel had to create something new. He had to create an alternative. Something between, on the one hand, the dreaded military, and on the other hand, no coercive force at all. And so he came up with this idea of a civilian-controlled police, something separate from the military, but nonetheless available for managing disorder and criminal activity. But here is where we come into the tension, or the puzzle. Because while the police was indeed crafted as an alternative to the military, it was nonetheless militarized from the very beginning. And the new police, in fact, borrowed not so much from the military per se, but more precisely from colonial forms of control. Now, it's commonly noted by historians that Peel, before he created the new police in England, had had colonial experience. And he did. He had previously served as Chief Secretary of Ireland, essentially its governor. But what I want to highlight is not only that Peel had served in England, but also that forms of colonial coercion that he himself had helped devise there had served as the inspiration for the civil police in London. Now you have to understand, in Ireland, before 1829, there had been a number of different coercive forms of regulation. Right? There had been the Dublin Metropolitan Police, which was a kind of armed urban counterinsurgency force whose duties were exactly to control crime in the capital and to manage disorder. Then in 1814, still a decade before Peel created the London Police, Peel created what was called the Peace Preservation Force to cover the rural districts of Ireland. And this Peace Preservation Force eventually merged with the 1822 Irish Constabulary, later renamed the Royal Irish Constabulary. Many of the constabulary's officers were veterans of the army. The structure of the force followed from the army's hierarchy. They were regularly drilled and trained in military methods. They were heavily armed, bearing pistols and bayoneted carbines. They were housed in barracks, and they were sort of to be called out as needed, and they were distributed across the counties, which were divided up into policing districts. The point is that all of these were colonial counterinsurgency forces, right? They were tools of the colonial state. They were meant to suppress anti-colonial unrest, suppress insurgencies across the territory, while also attending to criminality. And in the colonies, remember, the line between criminality and insurgency was always blurry. So what is crucial here is that these police forces were the model for Peel. Peel simply transformed them, or transferred them, to England with only slight modification. Take, for example, the very structure of the London Police. This was modeled after the colonial forces in Ireland. Just as the Irish Constabulary had been centralized in the hands of civilian officials, and in fact in Peel himself in Dublin Castle, so too was command and control of the London Metropolitan Police centralized in the Home Office of England, to be directed by Peel also, because at the time he was Home Secretary. And just as Peel's constabulary in Ireland had been organized along military lines with officers, non-commissioned officers and men, so did Peel structure the London Police in the same way. In fact, Peel insisted that the new London Police be commanded by commissioners, not just with military experience, but with specifically experience in Ireland. One commissioner was this guy, Charles Rowan, an Englishman who had not only been in the military, but had also served in Ireland. And in turn, Rowan laid out the basic operations for the police, drawing upon his colonial military experience. For instance, he and Peel structured the force according to a military hierarchy. Now, today in the United States, the police is organized as a military hierarchy. We call them sergeants and sirs, and there's a whole military structure. We take that for granted, but remember, this was an invention. This was a creation. And the origins of that lie here with Rowan and Peel. Rowan created this military structure where there was a series of other officers beneath him, including 16 sergeants, a title taken directly from the army. The new police was uniformed, just as the army was. And again, this was a new thing. The constable and watches in England that had been sort of dealing with crime had not been uniformed. And the color of the uniform was blue rather than the army's red, but notably the Dublin Metropolitan Police had worn blue uniforms. And many of the senior officers were taken directly from the military. And on top of this, the entire system of police patrol had a colonial inspiration. Each of the new police divisions in London were to be patrolled by constables operating according to a beat system. In the United States, this is very commonly known. It's when you have police officers walking around a particular neighborhood, walking around their beats. It's a very common institution, but in fact, the London police originated it, and the London police had simply taken it from colonial experiences. The beat patrol system was essentially a mingling of two models of colonial coercion. First, it took from the slave patrols that had originated in the British Caribbean and the American Carolinas. These, for those of you who don't know, had been created for inspecting slave dwellings for arms or illicit goods, disrupting any large gathering of slaves, hunting fugitives down, and generally keeping slaves in line. And they had been organized into territorial districts whereby they would patrol the plantations. Those were called beats. This new beat system then, that the slave patrols operated, was one part of the inspiration. The other part was from the British Army's new light infantry units. These were highly mobile counterinsurgency army units that Charles Rowan's commander in the army, Sir John Moore, had developed and used against slave rebels in St. Lucia in the 1790s, that's in the Caribbean, and then in 1798 to rout the Irish insurgents during the 1798 rebellion. Light infantry were essentially what Peel's Peace Preservation Force in Ireland were also. Small, mobile, heavily militarized units being called upon when necessary, utilizing open order formations rather than close order formations. And it's these colonial modalities were what informed Rowan's beat system. Assigned distinct territories that they were to cover, the new police patrols surveyed populations as slave militia patrols surveyed slave populations in their territories, but as the patrols were also meant to be flexible so that they could move across and through swaths of territory swiftly as the situation demanded, and mutually supporting, coming to the aid of other patrols when necessary, the beat patrols also mimicked Moore's light infantry and with them Peel's Peace Preservation Force and the Irish Constabulary. So, I could say much more about this early force. The point is, hopefully you get by now, that this police, the new police, was militarized from the get-go, and more precisely, it drew from colonial regimes of coercion, right? These were colonial modalities, not just military modalities. And in this sense, the term police militarization, I would argue, is not as precise as it should be. Yes, the London Metropolitan Police borrowed from military operations and forms, and in this sense we could say it was militarization, but it more precisely borrowed from colonial modalities of coercion. This is why, rather than militarization, what we really have here is the coloniality of policing. While police militarization is just about appropriating military tools and practices generally, the coloniality of policing as a concept highlights the appropriation of tools, technologies, tactics, and mindsets developed and deployed at the frontiers of empire to violently repress deviance and disorder from racialized peoples deemed other and inferior. And so to make better sense of this, I was trying to think about a way to theorize this, and the police literature, because they hadn't really acknowledged the colonial origins of policing, didn't have a lot to say. I ended up turning to a different set of conceptual and theoretical tools, and I ended up with anti-colonial thinkers. For what the coloniality of policing alerts us to is that militarization is essentially a product of the colonial boomerang effect, whereby the tools of empire overseas are brought back for domestic use. Now, this is an important concept, so let me just dwell on it for a minute. In the 1970s, in his lectures at the Collège de France titled "Society Must Be Defended," Michel Foucault alludes to this boomerang effect in one of the only moments, one of those rare moments where Foucault actually acknowledges that colonialism existed. Foucault alludes to this boomerang effect where he talks about this process, right? The tools come back. It should never be forgotten that while colonization transported European models to other continents, it had this boomerang effect. Someone else spoke about the boomerang effect, Hannah Arendt. She spoke of it in reference to British colonialism and Germany. Overseas colonialism, Arendt says in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, contained the seeds for totalitarianism in Europe. But in fact, before Arendt and before Foucault, it was the Martinican anti-colonial thinker Aimé Césaire who named the boomerang effect. He used the term to characterize Hitler's violent invasion and rule of neighboring European countries, claiming that what Hitler was doing in Europe was merely the importation of the processes and practices of European colonialism abroad. And before Césaire in the 1930s, the anti-colonial Pan-Africanist George Padmore spoke of something similar. He didn't use the term boomerang effect, but he tellingly spoke about what he called colonial fascism. He reported on how the British military and police in the British colony of Trinidad and Tobago were suppressing the rights of colonized peoples to organize and strike through the use of violent suppression, and he warned that British fascist movements and fascism in Europe were doing the same thing. Colonial fascism was coming home. And I think both Césaire and Padmore hit the mark here. One of the things you have to understand if you understand colonialism is that both the colonies and the peripheries of empire have typically been not only the site of brutal violence and racism and repression, but also the laboratory for modernity, the laboratory for modern repression, the space where imperialists develop novel forms of coercion, novel tools, technologies, and tactics of policing and militarism, and are free to use them on colonized populations, all justified on the grounds of racial inferiority. And what I'm arguing is that policing in Britain reflects the importation of these colonial forms, that is, the return of the imperial boomerang. That said, there's one more aspect of this story that I want to unfold, and it has to do with this concept of the imperial boomerang that none of these scholars actually lay out. And that is, why does the boomerang come home, right? Under what conditions does the boomerang return? Empire is a long-standing, ongoing process. So what accounts for why the boomerang returns when and where that it does? And again, this is something that you don't really find an answer for, or I haven't found an answer for in Césaire or Foucault or even Arendt. What I find is that the boomerang returns in sometimes subtle ways. It's not just about Hitler or Mussolini bringing back colonial forms. It happens in particular conditions that are the repeat over and over again, not just exceptional conditions. And those conditions have to do with racialization. And by understanding this, the logics of racialization that bring the boomerang home, we'll get closer to an answer for why it is that the civil police are militarized. What do I mean by this? Well, let me just return back to the London Met and the story of the founding of the London Met. If you read conventional historiography, conventional stories about why Peel created the London Met, what they'll say is that, well, crime had gotten out of control, strikes had gotten out of control, and of course, Peel got tired of calling in the army. And this is true. There were lots of strikes and riots and disorder. There were also a seeming rise in crime. When you look at the statistics, there seemed to be a rise in crime. But in fact, what most historians miss is that both this crime and this order were racialized at the time. What Peel and other officials were responding to when they created the new police was not so much crime and disorder in general, but rather the specific perceived threat posed by colonial peoples who had been migrating to urban metropolitan centers. And in England, this meant who? It meant the Irish. Of course, the Irish had been coming to England for as long as English rule had begun, but the early 1800s saw heightened migration even before the so-called Great Famine. The Union, as never before, facilitated England's colonization of Irish agriculture, a process which in turn ejected thousands of dispossessed, displaced, and destitute Irish subjects, a veritable colonial reserve army of the unemployed. At the same time, the rising cotton manufacturing and shipping industries required cheap labor, and the Irish filled the gap. In England, the numbers of the Irish rose from 40,000 in the late 1700s to 590,000 by 1830. And the influx of the Irish fueled all kinds of anxieties among the English, who began complaining about this invasion of the so-called Irish hordes. And the migration further fueled long-standing processes of racialization. The Irish were increasingly seen as fundamentally foreign, unalterably alien, and incorrigibly inferior. While scientific racism had yet to take full hold, references to Irish biology, blood, and stock increased in this period, mingling with cultural explanations of Irish inferiority. Stark differentiations were made between Irish workers and English workers. Countless experts and officials and employers claimed that the Irish were physically predisposed to certain types of labor, were less civilized, inherently more disorderly and more violent than English workers, and that this justified their low pay and low position in the occupational hierarchy. The Irish were, in short, the racialized sub-proletariat of England's rising cotton economy. And what all of this meant is that when Peel and the police reformers began in the 1820s to talk about needing a new police to deal with rising crime and disorder, the Irish were, in fact, their implicit and often explicit reference point. They saw the Irish as inherently lawless and criminal, and most officials blamed the Irish for the seeming increase in crime. They connected the Irish migrants to increased potential for uprisings in London and around the manufacturing districts of England. For in the English mind, the Irish were inherently disorderly and violent, and this perceived racial threat was what had compelled the creation of the Irish Constabulary and other violent Irish colonial forces in the first place. And now in the 1820s, to the English mind, the barbarians were at the gates. English officials made analogies between colonized subjects in Ireland and the Irish migrants coming to England, and made analogies between the colonial situation of criminality, uprising and revolt, and the situation in London. And in fact, many migrant Irish had joined the growing worker rebellions across the country, but they were seen as not only at the gates, but as flooding through them. In 1828, a Quarterly Review article blamed crime on the Irish, while also predicting outright rebellion. The Irish conspirators of 1798 were sending their men to England to incite English workers, and were acting as the Guy Fawkesites of Ireland, plotting to make a glorious bonfire of London. Even black radicals were added to the threat, as the London press seized upon the fact that William Cuffy, an English worker of African origin, had become a leading figure in the Chartist movement, and that the London press complained that the London Chartists were not, in fact, an English movement, but essentially an Irish movement led by an African. Oh, the horror. In short, the formation of the London Metropolitan Police was not a response to crime and disorder in general, but a response to the so-called Irish problem. And so it was fitting that to deal with the Irish problem, you use the same methods and techniques that you had used in colonial Ireland. And this, I'd argue, is why the Boomerang came home. It's why Peel and Rowan and other police reformers created the new police and modeled it after Ireland's colonial forces. While they certainly hoped to manage crime and disorder, also on their mind was the need to manage the fact of thousands of colonized peoples invading their putatively sacred metropolitan spaces. The racialization of crime and disorder is what brought the Boomerang back, serving to militarize the police, or what we call militarization. It's therefore fitting that my sample of arrests made by the London Met in the 1830s, soon after it was created, reveals that the Irish were disproportionately arrested. While Irish-born children or children of Irish-born immigrants made up about 5.7% of London's population, the Irish often made up over 10% of all arrests on average, and at times constituted up to even more than that. The Irish were arrested essentially at double the rate they should have been if they were not over-policed. And this attests, I think, to how the modern civil police was racialized from the get-go. Now, in other cities after London, I said other cities developed their own police departments, and as I show in my book, it followed the same logic, right? In New York, Savannah, in the South, in other cities of England, it's the same racialized threat that ended up leading to the creation of these police departments, with some variations. I can talk about those cases further if you like, but for lack of time, let me jump ahead. And what I want to do is give one more example in the United States of a later wave of militarization before I bring us up to the present. And this wave of militarization that I'm going to talk about in the United States happened in the early 20th century. And this was a formative moment for US policing in the US. It's often called the Reform era or the modernization of policing. Prior to this period, as I've just said, police departments across the country already created their police departments. But in this period, and this is why historians and police scholars are so interested in this period, some new developments unfolded. This was the period when, after their formation, police departments professionalized, rationalized, and expanded their capabilities. They developed new methods of criminal identification, such as fingerprinting, and other methods to track and surveil criminals. They developed various specialized mobile squads to extend their reach. Right? So initially, patrolmen in the 19th century covered only their small part of their city, the beats. But in this period, police departments began adding mounted patrols, such as this one in New York City. These were mounted on horses initially, sometimes bicycles, later cars, and these were meant to cover large swaths of territory, and they were mobile forces. In essence, this period in the United States is kind of what led us to have the modern, centralized, powerful police departments that we think of today, and that's why it's so important for scholars. But this was also a kind of militarization, and more precisely, a boomerang effect. All of these reforms, or the vast majority of them, were in fact colonial technologies. You can see this clearly if I talk to you a little bit about this man, August Vollmer. He was the chief of police at the Berkeley Police Department starting in 1905, and he was the one who innovated all these new police developments, from mounting patrolmen and squads to setting up the first police training schools to using new records and criminal identification methods. He also instituted military-style training for police officials. Vollmer is known for all of these things, and that's why textbooks today refer to him as the father of modern policing. And in the United States, if you ever go and visit and having the experience of talking to a police officer, ask them if they know August Vollmer. 90% of them will say, yes, I remember him from my training. He's the father of modern policing. It's because he was the source of all these innovations. But what we have to ask is what made Vollmer so innovative? And he did a lot of this in Berkeley and then later in LA. Why and how did he come to this? Well, one of the things we have to note is that Vollmer had served, before he became police chief, he had served in America's colonial empire. Specifically, he had served in America's largest colony at the time, the Philippines. And for those of you who don't know this history, the United States had defeated the Spanish during the Spanish-American War of 1898, which brought America to the Philippines, and then took the Philippines as its largest colony. Filipinos resisted, leading to the Philippine-American War from 1899 to 1902. In the Philippines, this is not called the Philippine-American War, it's called the American War. And Vollmer had been involved in all of this. He had been in the US Army in 1898, fought the Spanish in the Philippines, and then, as part of the American occupying force in Manila, was among the few soldiers charged with policing the city. And after this, Vollmer joined the Americans' counterinsurgency efforts against the Filipino rebels. He had been handpicked, in fact, to join a new elite counterinsurgency unit charged with penetrating the interior to conquer and capture rebel leaders. Here's the unit, and there he is, in fact, up in the upper right corner. This is a picture from his papers. After all of this, Vollmer returned to Berkeley and became chief of police in 1905. And he brought with him some of the colonial counterinsurgency techniques that he had been exposed to and used in the Philippines. His idea of mounting police forces, for instance, came partly from the American Army's counterinsurgency efforts in the interior of the Philippine archipelago. He also borrowed intelligence methods from the U.S. Army's counterinsurgency efforts to gather data and surveil Filipino insurgents. He also brought back what's called pin mapping. And Vollmer is known, in fact, as the real inventor of pin mapping. Now, what pin mapping is it's when police charted the location of crimes in the city, put a pin in the map. You know, they would put a big map on the wall, and they would put a pin where crimes were. And then they could deploy their forces accordingly, right? So as one neighborhood had more crimes, they would send their mobile forces to patrol that area. Here's an example of a pin map that Vollmer did for Minnesota. This was just a pin map of assaults in Minnesota, right? So pins are placed in the areas where crime had occurred. Now, what's interesting is today, this is a common technique. It's just done with computers. It's called spot mapping or predictive policing. This, for example, is a New York City spot map of crime. It's the same thing, just done with computers and new algorithms. It's often called predictive policing. But Vollmer, in fact, adopted this technique from his days in the Philippine-American War. The U.S. Army is the real originator of pin mapping. The U.S. Army had innovated pin mapping techniques specifically to track the movements of Filipino insurgents, to locate their camps in the vast terrain of central Luzon, and embark upon their search and destroy missions. Vollmer simply applied this tactic to policing. He referred to it as the art of making war on the map, one of his 10 principles of policing. He later explained to police officers in Los Angeles that he really got these and other methods from his days beginning in the Spanish-American War and carrying through the Philippine War. After all, he says, we're conducting a war against the enemies of society, and we must never forget that. It's not accidental that if you look at newspapers at the time and begin tracing over time the term war on crime, it actually begins in this period. This is when the term war on crime becomes more dominant. And in fact, other police forces brought back much more than pin mapping, or mounted police. In the 1910s and 1920s, some police across the country were soon discovered to be using a mode of torture to extract confessions. The mode of torture was called the water cure. This was an early variant of waterboarding, where police extract confessions from suspects by holding them down and pouring water down their throats. In Chicago, police were found to do this, of course, largely on African-American suspects. Also, all throughout the Midwest and other parts of the country, police were found to be waterboarding, essentially waterboarding. This, too, was an effective empire. It had been the chosen mode of torture used by the U.S. Army in the Philippines during the Philippine-American War. They would take informants and pour water down the throats until they told them where the insurgent camps were. It was also used by U.S. military forces in the 1910s during America's occupation of Haiti. So here again, we see the colonial boomerang at work. And here again, racial logics were at work. In the early 20th century, of course, cities across the country had seen an influx of new immigrants who were perceived as racialized threats to order. Even Vollmer in California, right, they were seeing a rise in Asian migrants. California had been excluding Asian from entering the U.S. because of the Chinese Exclusion Acts, but lots of so-called illegal immigration continued, and a lot of Asians who had already been in the United States were migrating from rural to urban areas. And to many white officials, these new immigrants and migrants were not the most welcoming sight. Officials claimed that these migrants brought a rise in crime and decay in public morality, and the specter of lawlessness and disorder, such as with this image of the Chinese, dominated the headlines. Crime and disorder was thus racialized again, and in the eyes of authorities, a more powerful police was the way to deal with it. And more specifically, tools and tactics and techniques from the colonies were seen as the best way to deal with it. After all, those colonies were also filled with peoples racialized as inferior, as morally suspect, as having inherent tendencies towards vice and disorder. And so for white officials, it was perfectly appropriate and logical to import colonial methods for the purposes of domestic policing. It was, in fact, by this very logic that August Vollmer became police chief in the first place. Previously, in Berkeley and the neighboring Oakland community, white classes had been fretting about the increase of Chinese migrants from elsewhere in California. They had been especially appalled at the so-called Chinese gangsters and their opium dens that had been purportedly corrupting white morality with their drugs, and worse yet, young white women. The white community therefore urged Vollmer to become police chief exactly because of his experiences in the Philippines, where he had already dealt with the Oriental race. According to a newspaper account at the time, Vollmer's friends said to him about becoming police chief, "It will be a fighting job for whoever takes it. That's why we want you, Gus. You were a pretty good fighting man when you went up against those goo-goos over in the islands." Goo-goos, of course, was the derogatory term, the slur for Asians at the time. So again, we see the same logic, right? Perceived racialized threats summoned the boomerang, brought it back home. So all of that said, let me head towards a conclusion with a few more points. First, I've only spoken about these two waves of militarization, but there have been others since then. Consider, for example, the development and spread of tactical units. These are heavily armed, small mobile forces, such as you saw first in Ireland. But then after World War II, both US and British empires developed them further in their colonies. They were to be different from the regular forces. They were specialized and elite, to be called out at a moment's notice, particularly useful for handling all the anti-colonial rebellions that were spreading around the imperial world in and around World War II. They had become the favorite police unit for squashing protests and insurgencies, such as this tactical police unit in Hong Kong and in Singapore and in Hong Kong. They were especially useful when students revolted in the late 1950s and 60s. These units then made their way to the US and Britain. They inspired the creation of tactical units across the US, for example, such as the Tactical Patrol Force of the New York Police Department. This was created in 1959, modeled after colonial tactical units, and it was created in response to a perceived racialized crime wave of gangs consisting of Puerto Rican and black youth in New York. Notably, this was also the force that later broke up the Columbia protests in 1968, the protests against the Vietnam War. That unit was later renamed the Strategic Response Group. And it was this unit that violently suppressed the George Floyd protests in New York City, and most recently, the pro-Palestine protests at Columbia University. And when you look at their training manual, I have access to their training manual, you'll see all the techniques that they took from the colonies, kettling, all these various techniques. There have also been a number of direct links between the US police and the Israeli state, Israel being a prototypical imperial client of the US. Since the early 2000s at least, police officers and police chiefs from various US towns, even the smallest of US towns, San Bernardino, California, Orlando, Florida, Haverhill, Massachusetts, have traveled to Israel to observe and learn about so-called counterterrorism from the Israeli military and Israeli National Police. Officers have gone to the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the border with Syria, and Israel's Municipal Police Academy to learn about intelligence gathering and various counterterrorism tactics, to learn about various technologies of surveillance and patrol. And this has involved not just local police from these small towns, but also officers from the FBI, and yes, from ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And I've looked at some of the documents involved in this training programs and visits, and the modules are telling. As Israeli officers teach US police officers various tactics and intelligence gathering techniques, they also instill a racialized and ethno-religious counterinsurgency mindset that constructs Arabs, and particularly Muslim Arabs, as threats to peace and security. Without any qualification at all, they rehash the Orientalist stereotype that Muslims, and especially Palestinian movements, are a danger to be surveilled and repressed, that they are inherently terrorists. This is the stereotype that the US police bring back to the US with them. And in this sense, it's not surprising that this racist boomerang comes home. And with it does the police repression of dissent, including student protesters, many of whom in the United States are Muslim, as well as repressing their allies. With this in mind, let me conclude by returning to the puzzle with which I began. Remember, I said that the civil police theoretically is for protecting citizens. Therefore, policing should be peaceful, indeed civil. The military colonial police, on the other hand, are aimed at repressing ostensibly inferior subjects and enemies, and thereby employ uncivil tools, violent militaristic methods. The militarization of policing through the boomerang means that those boundaries are transgressed. Citizens are treated like colonial subjects. In other words, it's not just that the police in the US and Britain are militarized, it's that there has been a slow and continual convergence, a convergence in form and function between the policing of subjects abroad and policing subjects in the metropole. But why? Remember, this was the puzzle. Why? Why is it that the so-called civil police have come to treat citizens as if they are enemies and colonial subjects, using the same means and methods that they use on the latter? Well, hopefully by now you see the answer. The civil police adopt militaristic colonial modes of coercion on citizens and treat those citizens like colonial subjects because police see citizens and immigrants as colonial subjects. And the primary modality for this categorical transformation, the key social code by which this miraculous subsubstantiation of citizens into subjects occurs, is racialization. By racialization, citizens are constructed to be inferior, dangerous, and violent, just like colonized peoples. They are seen to be subhuman specters, the dark criminal, the dark colonial subject, who encapsulate the white public's feverish fantasies of fear and horror. Racialization thus transfigures citizens into, as Chiomembe puts it in a different context, a menacing object from which one must be protected or escape, or which must simply be destroyed if it cannot be subdued. And this process then warrants, actually demands, the importation of militarized tools, tactics, and technologies that had been originally deployed on colonized peoples abroad in the first place. Our very racialized image of the criminal, I would argue, has colonial roots. Just as white colonial settler populations constructed colonized peoples as inherently violent and criminal due to their racial status, thereby warranting militarized policing in the colonies, so too do white publics and officials in America's cities today and in Britain call for and justify militarized policing of black and brown populations, many of whom are immigrants, based upon racialized assumptions of the latter's putatively criminal and violent tendencies. And so too do white publics and officials justify militarized policing on black and brown students and their allies based upon ethno-racial assumptions of the latter's supposed proclivities towards anti-Semitism and violent terrorism. These constructions of policed populations are as old as empire and colonialism themselves. To conclude then, I hope one of the implications of my argument is clear enough. That is, racialization is not only the logic behind the return of the boomerang, it is also a kind of Trojan horse. It is the modality of legitimation for bringing into the metropole, bringing into liberal democratic societies, militarized tools and tactics of policing. Racialization is the Trojan horse by which these tools and tactics, which we call policing, are ushered into the metropole, and which are thus readied to be unleashed on all members of society. Keep in mind that these tools of violence and repression that we call policing, though they have been birthed in response to racialized colonized populations, they are ultimately modular, right? Once integrated and institutionalized and normalized in society, they can be used on any and all populations, set up for use against society as a whole by would-be authoritarian or fascist regimes. And this keeps me up at night. This, I fear, is what we have to worry about in the near future. And this, to conclude, is why our struggles against authoritarianism or fascism or militarized policing must also be struggles against the ignorance of racialization and the temptations of colonialism. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Julian. I think a super dense but super clear and probably also super depressing talk. Thank you very much. I think if your goal was to convince us of the importance of historical analysis for contemporary social science research, I think also mission accomplished. I have 2 pages scribbled full of notes, but only 10 or so, 10, 15 minutes to pitch some questions at you. So trying to figure out which ones are maybe also of broadest interest. Maybe a first question, and this comes also from a previous project I had that was looking at the blurring of public and private security organizations and agents, and also how technologies and so on move back and forth. I was wondering, for your sort of analysis and the larger history you're sketching here, it's by and large a state-centered analysis, which makes a lot of sense, of course, if you're looking at imperial logics and how different state agencies are influencing each other, or how different how military officers become police officers. But I'm wondering, what about, in addition to this imperial logic, what about economic or commercial imperatives within, but also beyond the state? Historically, but also more recently, who's profiting? Who has what to sell? So I think you know much more also about these recent instances of U.S. militarization. But I remember when Ferguson and so on were in the news, it was also clear that these police forces at the urban level were buying all kinds of military technology, sometimes the sort of hand-me-downs from the military, but also buying Israeli, for instance, technologies. So there's also there's a sort of intrastate sort of money to be made, or profits to be recouped when you sell your hand-me-downs off as the military. But there's also a whole array of private companies that can earn so much money off of exactly the same racialized threat. So I was wondering how does, in addition to these political, sort of the politicians who stand to gain from sort of mobilizing racialized fears and organizing police activities around that, and the police themselves, what about private logics?
Thank you for that question. That's a very important question. And the short answer is you're completely right. There's always been profit to be made from racialization and colonialism, and similarly, there's profit to be made from militarization. August Vollmer, when he first started having his officers trained to use guns, of course, they had to purchase guns, and the gun companies in the early 20th century became these powerful entities. Fast forward to today, just one example. Vollmer's pin mapping today is done by software technologies. Comstats, yes. And various surveillance technologies. One of the many companies that have been pushing this on police departments is Palantir, who has also been operative, of course, in the Israeli, the Middle East, and during the war, the so-called war on terror in the Middle East, and of course the Israeli-Palestine conflicts. So these tech companies, I think, are the new companies that profit primarily, as well as the traditional arms companies. So I think you're completely right. There's a whole political economy here, a whole policing, military, industrial tech complex that I think we need to understand better, and definitely is part of the story. So thank you for that. Yeah.
Okay. Is it also, as you say, I think the prison industrial complex, also people starting to benefit from ICE and so on.
The detention centers, of course, provide, in the United States, the detention centers, most of the immigrants aren't criminals. They're detained in prisons that are created expressly for this purpose. And they're there for weeks, months sometimes, and huge profits are made. Those are detention centers that the federal government, the United States government, has to pay for, i.e. my tax dollars have to pay for these detention centers, and companies that profit from it, like Core Civic, they make a huge amount of profit, and of course, trace the money. They always contributed to politicians. They were huge contributors to the Republican right wing that pushed these detention policies. So it's through and through the whole system. Yeah.
But in rural areas, sometimes a source of employment that also makes
just like the military, right? The military employs lots of people. It's a whole political economy that gets ingrained in society, right? And in the whole economic system, which makes it all the more difficult to fight.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. As a second point, this is sort of a geography question, so with my geography hat on. I was wondering, when we think of the boomerang, and it's, I think the way Foucault theorizes, but also the other people you mentioned and yourself, it's a relatively straightforward. You have the metropole. You try out things in the colony, and then they boomerang back. So it's sort of quite binary, out and back. But I wonder, historically, but especially now, is it such a clear like back and forth or out from the metropole and back, or is it a more multi-directional type of mobility where we see, for instance, also Brazil, as part of the peacekeeping force in Haiti, trying out things, and then they use in urban areas sort of pacification as well, but also at the same time importing and doing the same type of trips to Israel and taking what's used in Gaza in Brazil. So this type of mobilities that might not even involve the U.S. But I was also wondering about the U.S. themselves. So the story you sketch is fully convincing, but I'm wondering how, if we take also the comparison between the US and the UK, then the US doesn't sit as easily in this sort of colonized or colonial metropole. Not even so much because it was itself a former colony of Britain, but because at the same time and before the imperial endeavors of the U.S., there was always the U.S. South, which you yourself also introduced, but you point to the mounted patrols in the Philippines, but you also pointed to the slave patrols, which were also mounted. So how does that work where you have also an internal colony, or where you can also talk about places such as West Virginia as internal colonies that were different types of exploitation and internal sort of hierarchies and policing. So I'm just wondering, if we take these multiple sort of internal forms of colonialism, different global circuits, how does that maybe complicate Foucault's and Césaire's and Padmore's analysis?
Yeah, that's also a great question. Certainly, this is more than a sort of metropolitan core story. All of those things you mentioned, so with American settler colonialism, a lot of the tactics used on Native Americans as well, then come home in different ways or come to the sort of the mainland, so to speak, but largely to urban areas. So you have that dynamic. So internal colonialism is also part of the story. It's just not part of the story I could get into. You also have, in particular with the United States, the United States exporting these methods again. So they bring it from the colonies, they develop them, perfect them, and then after World War II, the United States sent out hundreds of police advisors to the newly developing states all across Latin America. One of the officers who helps set up Germany's police department, Germany's police forces after World War II, because the United States occupied Germany, was a student of August Vollmer's. So these technologies, these mindsets, these policing forms get exported to the rest of the world after World War II as well. By now, I think there's just a constant circulation through various training programs, back and forth, all across Europe, all the way to China. Militarization is just the norm, and it just circulates in all these different ways. But for me, what's most interesting is the origins of it, and just to recognize the origins, these racialized and colonial origins, and to peel back those layers. And just lastly, the boomerang effect is really just a concept for me to make sense of one part of that flow, right? We probably need other concepts to think about the wider circulation. But for me, this boomerang effect is kind of like a middle range concept by which to capture one part of this larger complex flow. Yeah.
Well, as you're saying that, I think, so my own research has mostly been in Jamaica. And as part of this project, we were also looking at these same type of mobilities and interviewing also aid officials, foreign development aid in Jamaica, including from the U.S. Embassy, because Jamaica has issues with security, but also with police brutality. a lot of development aid going towards improving policing. So there was a U.S. Embassy high official who said, we're very, very interested in like helping the police professionalize and let fewer police homicides. So we're helping them like think through a non-lethal toolkit where they have other tools than just a gun and they kill fewer. But at the time, but even more so now, I think this kind of ironic that the U.S. is trying to develop other countries and tell them how to do non-lethal policing when evidently there's some concerns there on the U.S. side. Okay. Another. Maybe I'm sort of switching questions together, so maybe this to some extent is my last one. But I try to be hopeful, but I'm not too good at it myself. So I'm going to try to ask you to help me out here. But I really appreciate it as a Caribbeanist, you also mobilizing Caribbean theorists, Pat Morris is there. But wondering if we can take these insights into how colonialism works, how colonial logics, racialized logics travel. Is there also something to be learned from anti-colonial mobilizations, anti-colonial tactics to stop fascism, counter racialized logics? And one thing I was just thinking of, it's not contemporary, but as part of a lecture I was putting together on mapping, but also counter mapping, I ran into this article on African American counter mapping from the early 20th century, which actually was quite similar to the Volmer. It wasn't quite a pin map, but it was. It was quite organized, a collection of data in tables of lynching, but also mapping to show like this is where lynchings are concentrated from 1900 to 1931 across different U.S. states, to also just make visible, to use maps as a visual technology, also to it's basically crime mapping, but not from police forces, but from populations targeted by lynchers. So. I didn't necessarily stop lynching immediately, but as part of sort of using knowledge, using technologies to counter the racialized logic of policing, can you also find inspiration historically or in the present day where you say, here's also where we see the circulation of anti-colonial logics that might help us think beyond just it getting worse and worse?
Yeah, thank you. That is an attempt to actually think of, hopefully. So let me try to end this, our Q&A before we open it up with something a little bit more hopeful. So a couple of things. One is certainly these tactics and technologies can be redeployed. It's what anti-colonial movements always did, both the concepts and the tools. One of the things anti-colonialists did is redeploy notions of the nation state, right, to inspire and to mobilize. But in terms of tactics and technologies too, one example is in Baltimore, the city of Baltimore, there was, the police were using drones to surveil the city and to be able to locate possible insurgencies and so on during the Black Lives Matter protests. And what some groups have did is not only make that illegal, they were able to pressure the state to make that illegal. They are using, protest groups are using drones themselves to try to patrol where the police are and so on. And of course, the local governments are very scared of this, right? So we could, in Chicago, for example, probably hopefully use drones to maybe track where ICE is, but that's why the federal government has tried to make the use of drones illegal. So there's constant use and redeployment of these tools that I think we can think about as forms of mobilization. There's also local level struggles. I mean, in the United States, for example, so much of policing is the local level. It's about the city rather than the federal level. And this is where a lot of the dynamics with Trump's regime comes in, because he's trying to take control over police by using federal forces rather than local forces. But in some cases, in a decade or two ago, some cities in the United States, some towns, passed laws preventing their police officers from going on these training missions to Israel and so on. And so they made it illegal to use public money to send officials abroad to do this kind of training. Just a minor kind of pushback, but I take some hope in all of these minor little attempts. And I'm just reminded more broadly, I mean, the other reason why colonialism is such an interesting, important part of the story for me is not only that colonialism is the site where these tactics are developed, but also when you think about the success of anti-colonial movements, I do see them as successful. For centuries, the Western world dominated the world based on the assumptions that colonized peoples were inferior and didn't deserve their own nation states. But by the mid-20th century, right, colonization, at least in the traditional form, became illegitimate, right? Suddenly, it became illegitimate to colonize other territories, or at least it became more difficult to. And I would argue that at some of my research I've done, the main reason for that is anti-colonial movements. Colonized peoples stepping up and declaring their humanity and fighting against the racialization and the assumption that they're not deserving of their own nation state. So now the UN has embodied the principle of national sovereignty, right? This is a norm that isn't always equally applied, but it's a norm that exists today and that didn't exist 100 years ago. Right? It didn't exist 100 years ago where colonialism was legitimate. So the making of colonialism illegitimate, I would argue, marks the success of anti-colonial movements. And it's a long struggle, but to me, when I think of how overpowering colonialism was, I also think about how successful colonial movements were in changing what the global norms are. And so I take some hope in that.
Great. Well, on that note, please join me in thank you, Julian.
Thank you.
And